All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Redefining Risk, Risky Business Part 2, where today we'll be focusing on managing organizational risk in an evolving landscape. I'm Sandhya Nakasi, co-CEO at Common Future, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. As we get started, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share your name, pronouns, organization, where you're tuning in from, and what you're looking to gain from this conversation. In recent months, we have experienced dramatic shifts in the role of federal government to address economic disparities. A destabilizing funding environment for economic and racial justice work, an increased risk in the operating landscape for nonprofits more generally, and we've heard from many organizations that are evaluating and raising questions about what it looks like to operate and effectively assess and manage risk in a continually shifting political, economic, and legal environment. And we decided it was time to elevate these discussions in an effort to learn from each other, to grapple with the tensions of balancing mission and the protection of our work, and potentially through these discussions, find a new pathway to forge together. Joining us today are leaders from five leaders that are part of Common Future's wider network. I'll take a moment to briefly introduce each of them before we head into the panel discussion. First off, we have Deepa Iyer, who's the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Building Movement Project, a national nonprofit organization that catalyzes social change through research, resources, and relationships. At Building Movement Project, Deepa leads the Solidarity Is program focused on building narratives and infrastructure for transformative solidarity. One of her contributions to the field is the Social Change Ecosystem Map, which has been making the rounds recently, supporting individuals, networks, and organizations to identify their roles and build connections across the ecosystem as we collectively push for change. Her books include Social Change Now, a guide for reflection and connection, and We Too Sing America. We also have Kelly Burton, who's the CEO at BIA, and also a political scientist, serial entrepreneur, and change agent who leads with passion, purpose, and vision. BIA is a national intermediary that has re-granted over $2 million and supported more than 200 organizations with capital, policy advocacy, technical assistance, research, and national convenings. She's also the founder of Nexus Research Group, a social impact firm that works with foundations and large-scale nonprofits to help them catalyze change in local communities, and Founders of Color, a digital platform committed to helping minority entrepreneurs grow and scale their businesses. We also have Vishal Reddy, who is the executive director of Work4 and also a collective bargaining specialist. Work4 leads the national effort for a 4-day, 32-hour work week with no loss in pay. They're doing this by engaging and connecting employers, policymakers, unions, and workers through their 4 program areas of union and worker support, building local chapters to further local efforts, workplace engagement, and tracking and advancing public policy. We also have Erica Seth Davies, who's the CEO of Rhea Ventures, which aims to transform the US market for sexual, reproductive, and maternal health into a vibrant and equitable one through its impact investing, ecosystem building, corporate engagement, and narrative change work. Erica is a seasoned leader with more than 20 years of experience in development and fundraising, program design, collaboration, and partnership management, as well as racial equity advocacy. She's also the founder of the Racial Equity Asset Lab, a venture that centers racial equity and impact investing and works to shift capital to address the persistent racial wealth gap. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Jaguna, my friend and co-CEO at Common Future. Jennifer is an attorney, executive leader, strategist, and writer passionate about creating the conditions for all people to thrive. Whether it be within institutions or in the broader economy, Jennifer focuses on improving conditions for and supporting the economic solutions built to empower Black, Indigenous, and other communities that face exclusion and extraction from our current economic systems. Prior to her promotion to co-CEO, Jennifer served as Common Future's COO, where she implemented many initiatives, including the 4-day work week, equitable compensation, caregiver stipends, and others to create a more equitable workplace. Jennifer is also an Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity and serves on the board of Race Forward. And finally, before I turn it over to the panelists for our discussion, we will be recording this webinar. The recording will be available within the next few weeks or so, along with key takeaways. And we will be reserving 15 minutes at the end of today's panel for Q&A from the audience. So as questions come up, please feel free to place them in the Q&A. And with that, we'll get started. So I want to start with you, Kelly. We've all been on calls that have been sharing guidance around the line between what is legal and what is a question of risk management. But we know that applying this in the day-to-day is tricky. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how your organization is thinking or trying to think strategically and systematically about managing organizational risk. And while you're also sharing that, if you can talk about some of the costs, not just monetary costs, to managing this organizational risk in this moment.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you, Sandhya. And hello, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces. For us, when it comes to risk mitigation, it's like a before and after. So it was risk mitigation before the election and then risk mitigation post-election. And risk mitigation before the election was just about crossing your T's and dotting your I's. And as they say in the church that I was growing up in, doing everything decently and in order. So if anyone ever paid attention, you could demonstrate all of the ways that you were operating above the board. After the election, it changed where risk mitigation was really about staying out of the crosshairs of an administration that is adverse to the issues that matter to us and to our community. Um, uh, we started as an organization November the 5th, November the 6th, and really updating how we think about this. We had a sense as to what would come down the pike. I think the first day of the current administration, of the first 10 executive orders, 3 or 4 of them were focused on eliminating all things DEI. DEI became public enemy number one. And so for us, an organization that's dedicated to supporting Black innovators and entrepreneurs, we knew that it was a possibility for us to become a target. And so there are a lot of things that we did, but they centered on 2 things in particular. Number one is really evaluating our external comms. How do we talk about our work externally? And the second piece was around programmatic grant making. And so what were the criteria that we put in place in order to support our member organizations? It's been a long process. It's something that we thought we would be able to tackle in a few weeks, and it took us several months and really activating our entire organization in order to get aligned and to get all of the things done. There are still things that we are processing through. I'll give you a very specific example. Oftentimes, especially when we're applying for new grants, we're having to scrub any reference to Black folks, Black communities, diverse communities, marginalized communities, people of color, you name it, which has in and of itself, been a very traumatic experience. But it kind of, in going through that process, there was very little of our content that did not in some way represent the specific communities that we were touching. And so we had to scrub our website. But whoever teaches you how to scrub a website, so now if you go to our website, it's a pretty janky looking website. So now we're at a place where we're like, okay, we did all the things that our public affairs team told us to do. Now it's kind of like you have to get back to some level of normalcy, having had to like go super, super minimal. And now it's an opportunity to calibrate and say, okay, how much of this do we really need to continue to adhere to now that we've kind of gone down to the bone? How do we build ourselves back up in a way that allows us to continue to do the good work and stay off the radar, but also with the data that we've been able to pull in over the course of the last 6 months.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And I mean, just even as you're sharing kind of all of these actions taking, it's not just like you snap your fingers and like things are changed. It's a lot of time, staff effort, kind of communicating externally, internally, um, and in addition to kind of the emotional costs that you talked about as well, that just like layer on top of what else do you have to keep looking out for in this environment, not just like what happened in the past and retroactively, but also looking forward what may happen. Jennifer, I'm wondering if you could also add to what Kelly was talking about and share from your experience as also another intermediary organization. What are some of the challenges that we I'll say we because we're a common future together, but we've been navigating, but you've also been navigating. And can you share an example of how that's also coming up in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And just plus one to everything that Kelly shared. So I'll talk about three main challenges that we're seeing. I think just by nature of the work of being an intermediary, we're continuing to support many partners across the nation during what is a very difficult time, as we always have and will continue to do. But we're having to do it in an environment that is really rough and where our existence as organizations doing this work is risky. And at the same time, we're not being adequately supported to do that work. We are, facing burnout, we're facing diminished funding, and in many ways, it often feels like we're having to go it alone. Just given where we sit within the ecosystem, not doing direct work, but supporting people on the front lines doing direct work, and sometimes at the same tables with philanthropy, but not quite philanthropy. I think the second is, we're still having to operate in an environment of short-termism and fundamental misunderstanding and devaluing of the work that intermediaries do. We, do a lot of the work that's often invisible or hard to quantify. We build hope and will. We connect dots. We fill gaps. We bridge across silos and so many other things. But when you can't measure this, and when it's also difficult to talk about the long term, just given that survival tomorrow is not guaranteed, how do you continue to make the case for systems change and longer term work? And then the third thing that we're seeing is we've been in a number of conversations where, funders in particular are treating direct service work and intermediary work as a binary rather than complementary work that supports different parts of a broader ecosystem. I talked about in previously that we're the connective tissue. We recognize gaps. We amplify partners and communities that are overlooked and considered too risky by philanthropy, and that help hold together that longer systems change work that's needed. And so I think these are three major things that to some extent were prevalent before, but certainly are amplified now in this environment and just make our work difficult. And I know for sure at Common Future, we're seeing all of these things play out in real time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. And I think that, the challenges that intermediaries are facing are not unlike challenges that organizations like community-based organizations are facing. These are all similar challenges. They're just at different scales and different and with different resources and kind of different angles towards the challenge. So I really appreciate you lifting up kind of how um, how kind of the this work that we're doing is all kind of towards systems change and it requires long-term thinking, but a lot of what's happening right now is just short-term thinking that really is kind of cutting up against a lot of the work that not only we all in this call are doing, but also a lot of our partners that are on the ground are doing. Erica, I want to turn it over to you because in addition to your work at RIA and the Real and all of the hats that you wear in this ecosystem, you've also helped to stand up the Freedom Economy, which is a membership network to support investors to navigate the slew of anti-DEI and ESG legislation that has been prevalent in the last, I would say, more prominently in the last 2 years, but rising up over the last probably 5 years and since the last administration. I'm curious where you feel our weak spots are as a broader ecosystem in managing risk in this increasingly hostile environment as it relates to social justice and racial justice work.
Sure. Excuse me. Thank you for having me on the panel. It's a privilege to be here with this particular panel. So, in standing up Freedom Economy back in 2023, or starting the work, this was around the time that the Fearless Fund had been targeted. And so the conversation and the effort actually started that far back because I think we recognized, and this goes to the question around some of the weak spots, um, that there wasn't enough historic context and understanding of the the um, the pattern, right? Quite frankly, of retrenchment happening when there's been racial progress. And so, excuse me, people seem to be caught unaware. But from 2020 and the racial reckoning that the country was undergoing at the most recent iteration, that some of us were very clear that that was merely a window and that the retrenchment would be coming, and it delivered. And so, not having enough historic context for the ways in which racial progress is consistently met with resistance and retrenchment in the country is something I think that folks did not see coming and didn't necessarily prepare for across the field. And this was happening in the context of a field that's still actually emergent, right? So when we talk about impact investing, we're still collectively trying to make the case, one for the both and, but also sort of the spectrum, right? So the binary of either you're making a profit or you're doing good. It's sort of, excuse me, was I think a space in which people are already operating. And so you then have this compounded with a massive retrenchment effort that is now sitting in all three branches of government. And so having a sense of, wait, what are we actually dealing with? And I think this goes to that conversation about sort of short-term reaction and response versus an understanding of the long-term arc of where we've been, and then where we're actually going or potentially can be going as a country, as a field, right? Like as an ecosystem. So, excuse me, having done a lot of work at that intersection of racial equity and impact investing, I spent a lot of time, and I think a lot of us have actually explaining the context for the work that was happening at that time. And so to say to someone, if we do not address racial injustice in our country, this is actually a significant threat to democracy, required learning. It required this whole narrative shift. It required folks understanding even their role in the investment ecosystem differently. And so I think those are all somewhat, and that's probably one of the biggest, I would say, weak spots for our sector is we still don't have sufficient understanding of what it is that we're actually dealing with based on that historic context. So that's just one. And then I think another would be the, excuse me, lack of sort of the principles, the operating principles of movement building and organizing have always been in more social justice oriented spaces, but we need to actually be understanding and applying those principles in the context of what our ecosystem actually does. And so that does require more relationship building. That requires actually that we have a shared understanding of root cause. I don't know that we've ever gotten there as a sector. And so, excuse me, the conversations around power shifting and collective ownership and leadership at this time. I think all of those things kind of come together and create some additional challenges, additional set of challenges for the ecosystem when trying to manage the risks that we're currently facing. Because what that means is we may not collectively have a full comprehension of what the risks are of inaction or backing down. And so those are some of the, I think, the weak spots that one, Freedom Economy was seeking to address in standing up the organization, but also just observations of being in this space and doing work with investors for quite some time.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. I think what you're sharing, the second weakness that you're sharing, it really probably dovetails well into to the work that Deepa has been leading, and kind of how do we actually shift our mindset away from kind of this organizing in within kind of movements rather than like organizing as an ecosystem, and how do we build solidarity and kind of how do we really understand how intertwined and interlinked our work is to actually continue to push for change collectively. So I want to turn it over to you, Deepa, because your organization just released a report on the state of movements for justice and equity. And I'm curious if you could share what you're hearing and seeing, um, and what are you not hearing and seeing, specifically what you're not hearing and seeing enough of as we collectively engage in risk management, and what might be missing in this moment.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandhya. Thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be in this space with all of the other speakers and all of you listening. To answer those questions, I'm actually going to share a couple of slides, so just give me a second to pull those up. And then Sandhya, would you let me know if you can see them properly or not?
I can, but I am
Oh,
seeing
but
them
you're
in a
seeing other things. Yeah.
yes.
Okay. This worked when we were working on it just a
I
bit ago.
know.
So give me 1 second to make sure that it's okay. Um, all right, let's try it again. Um, okay, this should work. Yes?
It's working.
Excellent. All right. So I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about the types of attacks that we're seeing social movements and movement groups in particular face. This is a threat matrix that we developed at the Building Movement Project, which shows that movements, leaders, and groups are being attacked in sort of a cyclical nature. So we've heard from other speakers as well. This includes the withdrawals of funding for critical services. It also includes the congressional inquiries and investigations that are happening into certain types of nonprofits and funders. It includes reputational harm, safety and security in terms of violence and intimidation of organizations, and the targeting of nonprofit status by administrative, judicial, and legislative attacks. We also have seen in the work that we are doing with movement groups that frontline communities are most vulnerable in this threat matrix. So these are immigrant serving groups, climate justice groups, groups that are working with LGBTQ communities, as well as groups that are working with Palestinian, Muslim, and Jewish communities in particular. And so, in the conversation about risk, as we think about this threat matrix, we wanted to offer a couple of observations. The first is really that solidarity can actually be a strategy to withstand, mitigate, and redistribute risk. And this has a couple of different components to it. So, when we talk about solidarity, we're really talking about what others have already said, an ecosystem approach, this understanding that relationship building, organizing can all actually support us over self-preservation or individual organizational preservation. Solidarity, though, is such an abstract word. It's overused. So, what does it actually mean? What are some examples of it? So, in many ways, solidarity can be a narrative strategy, a legal strategy, financial strategy as well as a strategic way to build infrastructure. So this also includes you really mobilizing and organizing with others who are facing similar threats to coordinate messaging as well as mutual defense. It could mean mapping less impacted allies across various sectors that can be activated when needed and engaging in solidarity stances that could involve some level of risk. So, some examples that are also on this slide on the right-hand side that we've seen happen. So, we've seen, for example, mutual aid efforts that defend abortion clinics under threat. We've seen class action litigation, like the litigation that just occurred with the birthright citizenship order. We've seen cross-sector statements and narratives, pledges that organizations can be taking. For example, the Big Ten Academic Alliance has been pursuing a mutual defense pact in which member academic institutions would provide legal representation and defense if they become targets, for example. We've also seen philanthropic backing and investments. Over 710 charitable groups endorsed a joint statement from philanthropy affirming the essentiality of the nonprofit sector and committing to protecting the First Amendment. Financial sector backing, so making sure that organizations get to keep their accounts. Sharing back-end services. So what are ways in which organizations can actually come together for a lot of the infrastructure support that they need, whether it's joint representation with council or sharing public relations staff. And then finally, local, regional, national tables and working groups that can be activated really quickly to do community defense. So these are just some examples of when solidarity can be one of the strategies that's useful. Some questions that folks might want to consider, depending on where you're sitting in this ecosystem, is what is our organization's capacity to manage harms and absorb risks? Some of us have more capacity than others. How do we protect our work without becoming neutral about the issue? Who are our closest partners? What do they need? And also, who can we reach out and support, especially if we are not directly at risk for being targeted because we say don't take federal funding, for example. And then internally, really thinking about the alignment within our leadership around solidarity and funding and legal constraints that shape our choices. I want to close by offering 3 quick resources and tools that might be useful, and I'll put these in the chat. One is the framework that Sandhya mentioned earlier called the Social Change Ecosystem Map. This is a way to really think in this moment of chaos and confusion about roles that we might play as organizations that we have not played before, understanding that we are part of an ecosystem where different groups are playing different roles. So what might it mean to be an experimenter right now? What might it mean to be a disruptor? Another tool that I'll also put in the chat is rapid response stances in challenging times. We put this out before the election. We're going to put it out again in a couple of weeks with a little bit of a different tack on it. But, perhaps this is a moment where some of us can be defending, where others are documenting, and still others are designing. So thinking of different stances that can happen. And then lastly, just sharing our solidarity framework, which includes 5 different principles and actions around building deeper capacity to do solidarity work and take on risks, as well as really being clear what we mean when we say that we are in this through a lens of co-liberation. So I'll pause there. Happy to take questions as needed.
Thanks, Deepa. We've moved through this conversation pretty quickly around kind of risks, but I think what's emerging for me is, as organizations in the moment, we're responding real time to what is coming up in front of us. Where kind of what Kelly and Jennifer shared, like we're making real time decisions as leaders in this moment about what needs to be done, but also as Erica shared and as Deepa is sharing, like we simultaneously to responding to the emerging risks, we also have to step back and really think about how do we move together and develop what is an offensive strategy and a long-term strategy towards fighting against the forces that are trying to quiet and silence a lot of the work that we have been doing to protect communities and really to create a more equitable society. So I wanted to actually turn it over to you, Vishal, first to talk about moving from this moment of defensive strategies into offensive strategies, and some of the things that Erica and Deepa brought up are like, how do we act in solidarity? How do we move together as an ecosystem? But I'm curious from your work and what we can learn from the work that you've done, how could we re-envision some of these strategies into an offensive strategy rather than feeling like we're always on the defense?
Thank you, Sandhya, and hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So at Work4, we're building a movement to make the 4-day, 32-hour work week the standard for all U.S. workers. And now in this moment, we're trying to reframe risk management as an opportunity to build resilience and to build power, and not just to defend against threats. And that's obviously especially important in this moment, as all my fellow panelists have talked about, where we're seeing growing political attacks on nonprofit advocacy and an increasing risk of interference, not just from the state, but also from funders who are going to be pulling back out of fear of that interference. And so one of the ways we're responding at Work4 is by being really intentional about our funding model going forward. We don't want just a handful of big donors, whether they're philanthropic or individual, determining the boundaries of our work. And traditionally, issue-specific and movement-driven nonprofits like ours, we chase foundation grants and high-dollar donors, which has its positives. But as we're talking about today, that model can leave an organization exposed. And so, over the course of this year, we've been leaning really hard into what's typically seen as a risk management strategy, which is diversifying your revenue streams and reimagining it as a base building opportunity. So currently, we have 25,000 supporters on our list. And, what we're starting to do this year is turning those 25,000 supporters into a place-based and dues-paying membership-based structure so that a meaningful portion of our revenue can come directly from our grassroots supporters. And in return, those members would get some level of democratic input into our organization's future. And so, for us, while this is certainly on some level about financial independence, it's also about reinforcing our theory of change and building grassroots power. And I'll say we're actually learning this from conservative organizations who have done this well for decades. So the NRA is the best example of this, where they get $130 million a year for membership dues, which is a third of their funding. And they've been able to weather what they consider attacks, in part because of that dues-paying membership-based structure. And even conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation has 500,000 members who pay dues, which is very different structure than almost all of left-leaning think tanks. And so, at Work4, we think it's time progressive movements catch up and build grassroots power in this way. And that's because, managing risk isn't just about compliance or harm reduction, but it's also an opportunity for us to build the infrastructure that can weather storms and advance the work forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vishal. That was, Jennifer and I were actually just talking about this earlier this week around how successful kind of progressive movements of past have been during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. And I won't share what Jennifer shared, so I'll pause there, but and plant a seed maybe for Jennifer to add more. But I want to go to you, Kelly. In addition to what Vishal shared, what are some offensive strategies that you're thinking about as an organization?
I'm going to plus one what Vishal said. We are also seeking out multiple streams of revenue. For us, it's more along the lines of consulting and figuring out where the dollar's going and how can we track to that in ways that really align with our core offerings and core competencies. And I love this piece about figuring out how we democratize investment into our organization. But it goes back to Jennifer's point about infrastructure. I feel that the philanthropic sector really underinvests in infrastructure and doesn't really fully understand and appreciate what is necessary in order to deliver and deploy information and resources across our country around the array of social impact issues and needs that show up in communities every single day. Because that piece about figuring out how you build a campaign that really reaches people in such a way that they decide that they're going to give you some money, that's hard. That's tough stuff. It requires a real subject matter expertise that does not exist in most nonprofit organizations, even large or medium-sized ones with significant budgets and sizable staff. The other piece is that foundations have not really invested in marketing. That's a marketing core competency to be able to effectively tell your story and communicate your narrative and, reach people and hit them in the heart, as well as the technology that's necessary to collect recurring payments and all that stuff. So I think the challenge is that many of us are figuring this out on our own and having to bootstrap it without the necessary resources that would allow us to do it really well. And we constantly hear from foundations and philanthropy, you got to diversify, you got to diversify, but because they don't know how to do it, they can't help instruct us on how to do it. And so that's why these conversations are so important. And that's why we have to lean on one another to share learnings and the like, because it's getting really dangerous for organizations like ours at BIA that are scaled, that are supporting Black and Brown communities. I don't even know what the future of racial justice work looks like within this space and within this sector. And it's really important for organizations like ours, especially intermediaries, to figure out another way, an alternative path, so that we are able to socialize that among the organizations that we support and walk alongside of.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. I think every conversation I have with you, I'm kind of just struck by at least one or two things that you say. And I think that what I'm sitting with is like, what does this work even look like? What's the future of racial and economic justice work? Um, and I think, we're hoping in this panel here today, and with our efforts as a ecosystem, that to hold that in the future. But it's a good question. We don't know what it's going to look like, and I want to turn it over to you, Jennifer, to see what's resonating for you, and also like what, from your perspective, what are, we've heard revenue, we've heard investments in kind of collective infrastructure across the ecosystem. What's sitting with you right now in terms of an offensive strategy?
Yes, well, first I'll just continue with the thread that you and Vishal opened. I think all of us here are students of history, and so obviously these funding conversations are top of mind. So I actually found myself just Googling the other day, like, how is SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, funded to do, not just the work of advancing civil rights, but just dangerous work where they're putting their bodies on the line. And, it was through a lot of these membership-based individual small dollar donor, types of mechanisms. It was also through people like Georgia Gilmore, who was a woman that did fundraising through cooking and providing meals and supported the Montgomery Improvement Association that was, responsible for the Montgomery bus boycott. And so how do we think about and bring those lessons of history, and not just history, but, there's many organizations that are doing that kind of work today and building power at that grassroots level. So how do more of us, take on those kinds of ideas? I think the other thing I think about too is like when we reimagine risk, so often conversations about risk, and especially in this moment, tend to be the reactive, the compliance, the, dot our I's, cross our T's kinds of conversations. And there certainly is a role for that. And it's necessary. We have to have our, responses and our defenses ready to go as organizations, because that does help us survive. But we can't do that at the sake of risk and ideas of risk being proactive. And when you think about what risk management really is, it's really a way to make informed decisions. And so that can't just be left to what's going to keep us safe, right? Because there's already a false sense of safety and security that if we change the language, if we do this thing, we're going to be okay. We're not, right? Like we've already moved to the point where collectively, none of us is safe. And so if we understand that and we understand risk as being something that is proactive, we have a greater opportunity to connect it and link it to our values. That means our values as organizations, but also our values, as a collective, because it drives a different type of decision making that isn't just about this false sense of safety. If to give you an example, the work that Common Future does right now is risky. 5 years ago, it was bold and it was celebrated, right? 5 years ago, after the murder of George Floyd, it was the thing to do. And, for us, it wasn't just based on that. We had always been doing that work, but certainly in that moment, it was seen through that lens. We haven't changed. The environment has changed. And so what enables us to continue doing that work forward and speaking truth to power and doing the right thing that we know we need to do is our value system. And so when we have an opportunity to think about risk in terms of values, we're able to make the decisions that make this work long term, that make it sustainable. And if I think about, some of these past movements and past lessons, those were values that drove people to join SNCC, to put their bodies on the line. And, we're in a different kind of environment, and I'm not trying to conflate the two, but we have to see risk through the lens of being values driven and values aligned in ways where we do the right thing, not just the easy thing or the quick thing, or, maybe even the thing that a funder desires, or whomever the decision maker is in a given moment. And so I think that's really critical when we think about how we reimagine risk.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I think that's really important. to highlight how are we moving from kind of a fear-based reaction to risk to a values-based embracing of how we manage risk into the future, and build strength with that. And I think that that's something kind of everyone here is saying is that there's an opportunity for us to collectively build strength in this moment, as we think about risk management. I want to get a little bit tactical because I'm sure people on this call are trying to also get some solutions about, well, how do we do this? But I wanted to see if first, Erica and then Vishal, you can share a little bit more about the legal structures and entities that your organizations are utilizing and some of the rationale that you have behind this, because I think there's some really good tidbits around kind of how to build hybrid structures, how to um, utilize different entities to keep doing the work in different ways. So I'll start with you, Erica, and then go to you, Vishal.
Sure. So I became CEO of RIA in June of 2021. And what I stepped into, or rather inherited, was a nonprofit that owned, excuse me, a venture fund through a for-profit subsidiary. So RIA Ventures, nonprofit organization. We've just updated our mission to state that we operate at the intersections of racial equity, women's health, and capital. So we're keeping our language solid and focused. And this is to advance systems change, innovation, and financial and social returns. So that's what we do, and our actually structure now reflects that. And as we were going into this process of our own risk management assessment, something that seemed all clunky and difficult actually became more of a resource and an asset to the organization, because we've got options for how we can move in this current environment. And so we didn't have to be stuck to the corporate structure to be able to carry forward our mission. But that also meant, and it has meant for quite some time because of the work that we do on reproductive health rights and justice, that we've always somewhat been in the crosshairs because of positions that we take on access to abortion, for example. And so we've always had to cross the T's and dot the I's to make sure that our governance and our accountability to mission were very strong, so that we, if targeted, which was always a possibility anyway, but if targeted by folks who were opposed to the reproductive rights movement, the ways in which we were advancing that work as well, that we weren't vulnerable there either. And so it's something that we've been practicing for some time around cybersecurity, around the ways in which our structure could be weaponized against us if we weren't careful and mindful, again, of the relationship among those different entities. I'm happy to talk more about the actual planning, like our risk management process, but we'll turn it over to Vishal first before doing that.
Thanks, Erica, and thanks, Sandhya, and I echo everything that you just shared. And so at Work4, we've opted for a dual hybrid 501(c)(3), 501(c)(4) structure. And the rationale behind this was that there's a world where our organization focused exclusively on just building awareness about the 4-day, 32-hour work week, or where we just focus exclusively on supporting individual employers or unions or workers with their individual transition to a 4-day, 32-hour work week, or we focused on just pushing out policy reports to a general audience and to policymakers at large. But the reality is that our mission is to make the 4-day, 32-hour work week the standard for all workers in the U.S. And as we assessed the theories of change for our movement, we recognize there's no way to do that and to make it the standard, to make a workplace norm the standard without engaging in politics. Just as was the case, 80 years ago when the 5-day, 40-hour work week became the standard through legislation. And so given that we don't want to be limited by our C3 structure, which wouldn't allow us to chime in as much on politics, we wanted to be able to have a politics of specificity. We needed an organizational structure that would enable us to work on specific sets of bills and legislation that were being advanced that involved work time reduction. Now, with the C4 structure in place, we can work closely with elected officials who are interested in advancing a 4-day work week. In the past, we've mobilized our supporters toward specific legislative efforts in their state, whether it be in Maine or in New York or in Denver. And and though we haven't done it yet, the C4 structure would also enable us to put pressure on elected officials who aren't, supportive of this and are against this. And so, all of this work, just as the things I named before, are essential to our theory of change, and we didn't want to limit the possibility of that for our organization. So, and without a C4, it just wouldn't be possible. And so the last piece I'll share here is that, we actually didn't have a concrete vision for the C4 before we started to put things into place for it. And so, even if you don't have a concrete idea of how you might leverage a particular organizational structure or corporate entity, it's better to start the process of obtaining that structure now, because the process of becoming a 501(c)(3) or 501(c)(4) or 501(c)(6, I could go on and on about all the endless corporate entities there are out there. But that process can take sometimes a year or longer, and potentially with this IRS even longer. And so it's better to start that process now, so that by the time, one has a concrete vision of how you might leverage that structure, you know, you can just run with it. And of course, there's a cost, but it's typically a couple $100 for filing fees on any of these types of, new corporate structures. But we found that cost to be worth it, since it has unlocked a lot of special work for us.
Yeah, thank you, Vishal, and thank you, Erica. I think it's useful to know how legal entity structures can be um, utilized and flexed into, even if they're not kind of active in this moment, or feeling like they have a real purpose in this moment. But having these structures at our ready could actually support us to kind of flex in and flex out of different strategies as we think collectively about how to address the challenges we have ahead of us. I want to move to you, Deepa, and then I'll go back to you, Erica. Because Deepa, your organization, Building Movement Project, had done an analysis of what are organizations in this moment doing, and how are they tactically addressing risk and in this moment, whether it's legal entity structures or other practices. So I'm wondering if you could just lift up a few insights from that report, and then I'm going to move to Erica after that, who's going to share some more about this risk management structure and policies and practices that she set up in her organization.
Yes. So part of our recommendations from Building Movement Project are really around infrastructure. And we've talked about it a little bit, but I want to distinguish that in two ways. First is short-term scaffolding, and the second is long-term anchoring. And short-term scaffolding is often focused on a crisis moment. So it enables us to respond to like an immediate shock with really adaptive and nimble structures. It could mean a fast infusion of financial resources, for example, or setting up temporary coalitions or a rapid response network of lawyers, public relations professionals, et cetera. I mean, we've seen this in multiple ways, like during the pandemic, we saw this, we see this now. But the important thing is that this scaffolding, the short-term scaffolding, is not intended to last forever. It just stitches together our ability to handle periods of uncertainty. And then the second approach is the long-term anchoring. These are the deeper investments that can support our organizations for the decades to come. They're really about sustainability, resilience, and it could look like hiring staff to support internal culture work, or implementing governance models that include community participation, or long-term trust building with community and partners. The thing that often happens, though, is that we keep repeating the short-term scaffolding over and over again, and we neglect the long-term anchoring. And I've seen this happen in a lot of different rapid response moments, where there will be like funding for healing and grief circles, or a quick rapid response coalition, or immediate legal support. But then that doesn't transfer, right? It doesn't translate into long-term infrastructure for leadership development. So we lose people over and over. That's one of the things that we've learned from our work. Burnout and fatigue and losing institutional knowledge and skills building is really rampant across our movements and the sector. We don't do base building in our communities. And so because we don't have the long-term anchoring to do that. So we keep going back to them in crisis moments, but we're not building relationships with them in the long term. So both approaches to infrastructure, scaffolding and long-term anchoring, are vital, but they shouldn't be conflated, and they really need specific types of intentional investment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Deepa. I think that really sets us up for kind of some of the long-term work that Erica can speak to in terms of setting up a risk management framework, and how do you embed that into the organization, into the culture, into like the investment that you have made as a leader in your organization to support that?
Sure. So, excuse me, one of the things that we noticed early, and this is probably coming from the work I was doing with Freedom Economy, was that there was a conflating of what was legal and what was risk tolerance. And so all of a sudden, everybody's like throwing everything out because there was a statement about illegal DEI. Well, it's not illegal, right? And so I think a lot of folks were getting feedback from legal counsel or just I mean, it was a panic moment at the top of the year. So I'm very clear about that. But there was a lot of reaction and not sort of a settling of what is actually going on, what is legal, and what is our risk tolerance, and kind of sorting out how we're going to move our work forward within that space. And so I'll walk through pretty quickly. If I can share my screen, I think I can do this one. Was what we were actually working on at Rio. We called it Operation Undaunted. So kind of gave it a name so that we could reference when we were talking about this work. It wasn't just the risk assessment, it was how do we sort of look at our organization through the lens of continuing this mission, and what do we need to do to be able to do that effectively. So. Can I? Yeah. All right. So really what we were looking at were sort of legal and policy reviews, doing some scenario planning, and then actually bringing that into a regular risk assessment process. And so that legal and policy review, we were getting some of the resources from Freedom Economy about things that folks should or be thinking about, excuse me, at a very high level with respect to internal policies and some of the alignment or misalignment with what was going on in the overall environment. Then we were doing some scenario planning, right? Like, so thinking about what were some of the threats that we were potentially going to face. And even that exercise was it was random because we didn't know exactly what we were going to face. And so some of that scenario planning was, oh, what if we get doxxed? Or, what if we do get sued? Or what if somebody starts talking about our work badly because they don't understand it and aren't going to take the time to figure it out? So we were thinking about it in terms of finances, communications, and some of the programming, and then ultimately sort of landed in a risk assessment and management process, right? So where we really got focused on what are the actual threats to the organization, and how can we navigate those, right? So how do we prioritize where we focus our time and attention? What again are those most critical risks? How severe, if it actually happened, would it be to the organization? How likely is it that it's actually going to happen? So that we could then prioritize our decision making and prioritize where we needed to direct resources as well. And so that gave us the ability to understand what is our actual risk tolerance versus how do we take in all of this overwhelm? What do they call it? The flood the zone strategy. And then we're just constantly responding. And so these were the basic steps of what we decided to do, right? So kind of organized the threats or the risks in different categories, from legal and regulatory to reputational, all the way through governance. And then we set some criteria for how we wanted to understand and walk through where we needed to spend our time and attention. So we had a risk impact criteria. Was it high, medium, or low? High mean it could just actually not just disrupt, but actually completely eliminate our ability to risk. I mean, to operate as an organization. Medium was, again, moderate disruption. Could have some impact, but something that we could manage. And low was absolutely minimal impact. It's not going to, sort of derail the work that we do. And then we were looking at the likelihood. Is this something that's likely to happen quickly, right? Like in the next 6 to 12 months? Is it something that is possible, but is not immediate, or low? And it meant it just is unlikely to occur, but it's something that we'll keep our eye on. And that gave us the ability, once we put all this stuff together, to understand where do we need to focus our time and attention on what's immediate, versus what are things that we can actually think about, in subsequent quarters, or that's just something that needs to be monitored and paid attention to later. And then gave us our frame for how do we respond, right? Like, so once we identify these things, is it something that it's too great of a risk, so we absolutely have to avoid it? Is it something that we actually just have to accept, right? And I think one of the things that has come up is nobody's work is risk-free, right? Like, And so there is no way to eliminate all risk. And some of them you just have to say, you know what, this is too important to our mission, and we'll just have to accept this. What are the things that we can control or manage, or what are the things that we can actually transfer, right? And so think about insurance is one of those things, right? So we were going through our insurance policies and increasing coverages because we could actually, think about, okay, we could go bankrupt through litigation. Is that something that is covered in our insurance policies, so that lowers our risk? We've transferred that potential risk, and so put all that stuff together into what became a regular exercise for our organization and for our team, right? So naming the actual risk scenarios, having a conversation about what its impact would be, how likely is this going to be, what would our response be, and are there specific actions that we can be taking at this time to actually mitigate that risk? And what this gave us the ability to do by going through this process, and we do this on a weekly basis, just sort of revisiting some ideas and introducing new ones. It brought the temperature down and it brought the anxiety down so that we could then understand what is our risk tolerance as an organization so that we knew how we could show up on our mission, but also show up in solidarity with others. So now I have a better sense of, as the leader, what is it that we can actually take on and tolerate based on going through this exercise so we can be a better partner, we can be a better, organization. I'll stop sharing. Within the broader ecosystem of the work that's happening, excuse me, and be able to again continue to move effectively, knowing what steps we're taking to actually protect the organization and its mission. So I'll pause there and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that, Erica. And I think, what you shared really complements what Deepa was saying. Like the we're kind of stuck in this cycle of like what are the short-term fixes and really being able to sit down and be able to analyze the risk, be able to go through the process that you outline. Like that takes time, and you can't always be in this like firefighting mode while doing this. And so really kind of really kudos to you and your team for being able to make the space to like really establish a process by which you're thinking about what are the risks that are emerging? How do I kind of as you shared, turn the temperature down on everything that is being kind of flooded in our space? I'm going to move us to our last question before we move to Q&A. So if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And this last question is for everyone. So please, I guess I can call each one of you one by one. But if someone's feeling extra called to answering this question first, feel free to jump in. So during our prep call, Erica brought up this notion of what emerges from moments of survival. What can we shed to give ourselves the capacity to continue the long-term push for justice and equity? And I'd like to ask each one of you today to share what's one thing that you'd like to reimagine in this moment, big or small. What is up for you in terms of what we can shed moving forward? And I will pick someone to go first if no one goes off mute. I'll pass it to Vishal because you looked the most ready.
Well, ready is my last name, so was born ready, as some would say. But yeah, I'm a big believer that crisis is opportunity, right? And I think there's a lot that is really tragic and sad about the political moment that we're in. But to me, maybe it's like the eternal optimist in me, maybe it's the organizer in me. But there's a real opportunity here to reshape and refashion the ways we do things. And you know, I lead Work4, which is a nonprofit advocates for the 4-day, 32-hour work week. I work at a union where I bargain contracts for nursing home workers. I think there's a real opportunity here to, reshape our thinking about the importance of economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, and really leaning hard into those things and really just fighting for those things fearlessly. And I think it's the lack of a fight that's, lost us political power. And so that's not much of an answer as, in terms of managing risk, but I think I'm also a lawyer, and so I think maybe going to law school for 3 years made me, I think it's really important to be thoughtful about managing risk, but sometimes it's really important to take this step and take the leap in. And so I think I appreciate this conversation for, I think, really striking the balance of, making sure that we're leaning into the discomfort of, what building power often requires, whilst also, having the support and the solidarity and the connections and network to make sure we're not making that leap alone.
Thank you, Vishal. Ellie?
I definitely did not have the ready look on my face. I'm still processing. It's just so much every day is like the ground is shifting under your feet. And I just finished a book that I've been working on for the last 60 years on the relationship between racial caste and American democracy. And there's so much that we anchor ourselves in that we really believe is necessary to carry us forward that is fractured and is broken. And I think that there's a lot that in this moment, first of all, it's going to be a very long, protracted moment. I don't think we're coming out of it anytime soon. I think we're going to have to sit in it, and there are going to be some things that are broken, and some of the broken things we need to leave behind. Um, Things that we think have been serving us have truly not been serving us. So I think it's an opportunity for us to get clear, get lean, get focus. Whatever are your spiritual practices, like put those bad boys in place, because I think that this is a reckoning for our country, and it's going to require us to really achieve a higher level of collective maturity and a collective inner life in order for us to kind of move through it. So again, I told you there was nothing about that response that was ready. It's just it's still a lot still percolating in my brain, but the future's got to look different. And we've got to do the hard work and have the hard conversations and figure out like what the next iteration of this American project looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. I mean, I don't know that any of us are ready, but I think that was a very, very well put. And yeah, forward looking. I think you're asking the right questions. Like, how do we move forward? What does this work look like? Because it has to continue. Um, Deepa, I'm gonna pass it to you.
Yeah, it's a vital question. I think in terms of what we could shed, and I'm speaking from the standpoint of like the nonprofit sector, movement sector. I think one thing is shedding sort of our comfort zone. I think in many ways the nonprofit sector has become like super professionalized and captured in many ways. So that's one. Another thing we can shed is I think this like emphasis on purity that often really complicates movements and alienates and discards of people and communities. And then finally, like this sense of siloed work. And I think this often is reflected even in philanthropy, where it's like, well, we only fund this portfolio or that, right? And not understanding that we're multiple issue communities. And then reimagining, someone earlier said something around addressing root causes, and we've never done that well. I think like this, like there's no other moment to wait for that can get worse. I mean, maybe it could, but this is really bad, right? And so, getting rid of the band-aid solutions and really leaning into root causes. And then another reimagining piece that I've been thinking about a lot because I work on solidarity is what does it mean to build alliances with unlikely partners that go well beyond the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. Very good questions for us to mull over as we think about how do we build power and how do we expand the power of our work. Erica, and then I'll pass it to you, Jennifer, afterwards to round us out.
Sure. I don't, excuse me, I don't have much to add. I think fellow panelists kind of addressed everything. I think one question actually that I will say I reflect on frequently when that moment of discomfort comes through, where I find myself either trying to preserve something that probably doesn't need to be preserved, or at the very least needs to be interrogated. And I remember being in a therapy session once, years ago, and the therapist saying to me, "So how's that working out for you?" So there's been a number of things that have come up in this moment in this process, but I'm just like, how's that working out for you? Or how's that working out for the things that you care about, or the communities you care about, or the people you care about? And that gives me that permission to ask another question, to interrogate it, and to push myself just a little bit further for what the new thing is, the next thing can be or should be. And so I'm trying to use this opportunity, because we've all been fighting against what just got enmeshed in in our society, and so we've all been working on these other solutions anyway. But now I think it feels like time to be incredibly bold about those solutions, because how is it working out for us otherwise in the past? And so that's the question that I just ask myself, and encourage other folks to ask as well. When we find ourselves trying to preserve something that was comfortable, how's that working? And what can we think of and do next?
Yeah, I feel like I want that on a t-shirt, just to proclaim it loud and proud. I think for me, just this very conversation, and where we continue to grapple with what is truly risky, and the work needed to abandon, the just our prior notions of what risk is. Is it riskier to do all the things that this environment is telling us to do, or is it riskier to abandon the work that we've long been doing? And I think with that, it comes a recognition that every decision we make, every action we take responding to risk contributes to a broader tapestry that is the culture, that is the society that we live in, and what do we want that tapestry to look like? And so how do we factor that in when we're making, these day-to-day decisions as individual organizations, but also as a collective? And I think that's important to hold. And I think the last thing too is, this period is just stretching me so much, and there's so many days where I just feel at the edge of everything that I know and everything that makes sense. And so I'm just really being called to lean deeper into my faith, to make it through this period. And it's so, that's the opposite of what this sector, I think, Deepa was talking about, like the professionalization. It's like we're, especially as leaders, supposed to have the answers, supposed to have the guidelines, and in many ways we're figuring this out. And so I think just even having the space as a collective to name some of those challenges and those struggles to strengthen and fortify one another is really important.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Um, I think what you've named, um, and the question, Erica, that you've brought up is like, yeah, we're just like sitting on the edge of what we know. We've never really experienced life like this or leadership like this. We have history to look back to, but these are different contexts. And how do we use history to inform us? How do we use kind of our collective consciousness to inform us of how to move forward, and our gut and our feeling about what's right, and our conviction, and our values, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Jennifer? How do we use our values to really drive what the decisions that we need to make going forward? We're going to open it to the Q&A. To get us started, I am going to kind of lift up one question, which was given that organizations will calibrate risk tolerance differently. And I think this really speaks to, I think what Deepa you were naming earlier around how do we Deepa and Erica, what you were naming earlier around like how do we collectively work as an ecosystem, but and in an individual basis, our organizations are calibrating risk tolerance differently. How can we ensure that critical gaps are being filled, and what are the considerations for leveraging diverse roles and capacities? And I know, Deepa, you've offered the social change ecosystem map as a way to navigate that, but I'm curious for others. Um, what's coming up for you when you think about how to collectively move together, even though as individual organizations we might have different risk tolerances?
I can kick us off with that one. I think, you know, exactly what took place here, like the, you know, the sharing of resources and approaches and, you know, information. You know, the slides that Erica, you know, shared, there were so many comments like, oh, can you share that with us? Can, you know, we have access to that? And, you know, the information that Deepa shared, I think is so critical, because often we are doing these things at the organizational level and we don't often have time to come up and you know look around and see what our peers are doing and you know have greater opportunities to learn and share. And I think freedom economy is example of those kinds of spaces that I've you know been fortunate to be a part of and learn from. And I think it's critical, you know, because there's also this undercurrent of you know organizations that are closing in the dark of night under the moonlight of shame, like just you know because they didn't have ability to benefit from those resources and those conversations around you know how we sustain in these moments as individual leaders but also as organizations and institutions. And so I think space to be able to talk about the really difficult moments that we're in is really really important.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I'm curious, Deepa, if you have also something to add around, um, I think you mentioned earlier when you shared the social change ecosystem map, like there's also not only a questioning of what role do I play, but what role can I play? And I think this moment is also asking for this question of like, as Jennifer is sharing, like we don't know what each other are doing. How do we create more solidarity to figure out like maybe I'm doing this, but maybe I could be doing something else, and maybe I don't know who else is doing what. So like I'm curious how you are thinking about this, especially with the social change ecosystem map.
Yeah, I'll just say that I feel that one of the things that I've been noticing a lot is it really, to me, feels that we are actually more siloed now in different ways. I think it's because, as you said earlier, Sandhya, different organizations might have different responses to those questions of risk that Erica named so effectively in terms of the matrix. And I also think, and being a lawyer myself, I also think that lawyers don't often allow us to be in spaces together because of like we have to have different conversations with each organization. It depends on your right. And so part of this is like really pushing against that culture to say that it is actually important for us to lean in with our partners. And so that's where the ecosystem idea is vital. Like how many conversations are we having with organizations that are similarly situated? So whether it's withdrawals of federal funds, or whether we should sign certificates of assurances to get a grant, or whether it is around the congressional inquiries that are going to hundreds of groups, right? What are the opportunities for us to actually be in conversation with similarly situated groups to understand that an individual strategy can exist and it's not mutually exclusive from a solidarity strategy? I think that the infrastructure to have those conversations in a way that's really intentional and holds the individual risk, but also imagines what could happen in a collective impact manner. Maybe that could mean playing different roles, right? Some of us who don't get those letters could be the disruptors in my model. Some of us who maybe got the letters could actually be experimenters in trying a different approach. So I really feel like it's important to break out of the silos that continue to be created as much as we possibly can, by bringing the infrastructure so that more of us can be talking to each other.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Erica, from your vantage point, kind of setting up freedom economy and like this being a place to bring people together. Like, what are you seeing, and I'd be also curious because, like, when this is set up, it's like every organization's kind of scared, like, do I reveal what, like, that I don't know what I'm doing, or like I don't know the risks in my organization, and like how do you come into a space that you don't know everybody and like collectively share and be able to build together. So I'm curious what you're learning.
Yeah, and I kind of referenced it on the front end, like some of those principles that undergird a lot of movement work and just organizing, excuse me, was not standard operating procedure or the MO of how investors tend to operate, even in impact investing. And I think we're a more collaborative bunch than most. But even still, there are just sort of deeply held beliefs around competition and not collaboration that we were trying to actually move beyond. I mean, it was as simple as ESG, DEI, or not ESG, sustainability funding, and the ways in which sort of climate movement has been absent an analysis, right? Like a race analysis. And so wild organizing, we were actually then having to bridge some of that as well. So just the very notion of being involved in a group that is not a trade association or directly leading to some type of financial benefit for its members, it's more around community, shared understanding, actual shared communications, shared access to resources, like all of those things sort of fly in the face of the ways in which, excuse me, investing, capital markets, et cetera, like operate. And so there is this shift that people are having to live in real time. And then also making sure that we are providing, again, as much information as possible for that process to actually be real for folks who would join Freedom Economy. So making sure we were, to the degree that we could, embodying the principles that we were hoping to share with others that would be joining the organization as well. So it is a C6 for a reason. So that should one person or one entity be moved against, like it can operate on behalf of its entire membership. Like so, things like that were very intentional in structuring the freedom economy. So I think what we're learning is there's still a lot of learning that needs to happen overall in the ecosystem in which I think we all are operating, and so just continuing to highlight those things. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Super helpful. Um, Vishal and Kelly, I want to open it up to see if you have anything to add to what Erica, Deepa, and Jennifer shared. And if not, I'll move us to the last question.
I don't have much to add, but just we'll say, we're a young organization and a growing organization, and I think, um, you know, just have been really grateful how generous people have been with their time when talking about these kinds of things. And I think it's always I'm always like nervous about reaching out about things, but I've found people to just always be more supportive and gracious than I anticipate. And so I encourage others to reach out, even if it feels like you're reaching out about a very specific niche topic, like risk management for nonprofits or for advocacy. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder. We do embody like all of these as not as organizations in, I will say, the social sector. We do embody a desire to see change and a collaborative spirit. And so how do we lean into that in this moment? And we know that like on an individual basis, we are so generous with our time and our efforts. And I think that's evidenced by everybody here on this panel who's shared their time with us today and their learnings. Um, and so how do we just keep doing more of that and connecting and seeing what's possible? I'm going to move us to our last question. Again, this one is for everyone on the panel. And this is really one to close us out. Maybe on a note that feels hopeful in this moment. So I'd be curious, and I'll start with you, Vishal, and then I'll go through the rest of the panelists. Um, in this moment, I feel like as leaders of this organization, of organizations, it feels like risk management is like our full-time jobs. And so, it takes, I have to be very intentional to take moments out of my day to be like, why am I here? What am I building? Where am I going? And so I really want to take this moment for everyone on the panel to just share what's a practice that you have in these moments to think to gain clarity in moments like this, to really focus on what's necessary, and risk management is absolutely necessary, but it's not 100% of our job. And so what is it, what are the practices that you're taking um, to get clear and to refocus yourself? I'll start with you, Vishal.
Yeah, appreciate that. Well, I often meditate, and I have found that, when I give myself the time in the morning to do that, the rest of the day feels a lot more clear and straightforward. And so I think I encourage, it's hard to integrate new practices, but I have found, especially in today's environment, and I definitely learned lessons from between 2016 and 2020 where I was like, that was too much more noise than was helpful for my advocacy. And I think, I guess whether it's meditating or sort of reducing the noise in general, I think what I found is, part of the way the opposition wins is by cluttering our minds and getting us to be so distracted that we don't have clarity of purpose. And so I think, I've often found that the amount of input in my life is like way more than I need to do the work that I need to do. And so, I think there's various ways of cutting down the noise, and that's just one of them. But I think, you know, all to say, I think, clarity of purpose is really important. And I think that's an individual way of getting clarity of purpose. But I've also found like, unity gives clarity. And so I think like organizing also helps give clarity because, when doing organizing work, you have to always be in the business of finding consensus and purpose with others. And that can help open up the necessary self-reflection and introspection that, gives purpose and meaning to the work that we're doing. So, and it has the nice side effect of building power. So, um, yeah, appreciate the question, and I appreciate being in conversation with you all today, and appreciate the audience's time as well.
Thank you. Erica, what's a practice you have?
I think there are two things. So one, I have teenagers, and I have really started leaning into engaging with my teens differently. It should not have taken this to do that, but it's more of a curiosity about what they're seeing, experiencing, and how they're moving through the world right now. And that has just completely changed again what I think about and prioritize on a daily basis, and excuse me, feeling hopeful for the future because of the responses that I get from some of the questions. And I think the other, because it can get very daunting, there are moments when I'm like, is this even worth it? Like, is it even worth it to keep doing this? And then I remember that we are living in someone else's imagination, and that it is still worth planting the seeds to something that looks completely different, because somebody made this up and we can make up something else. And so I just have to keep reminding myself that you plant the seeds anyway. You may not ever enjoy the fruit or the shade of the tree, but the planting of the seed is worth it. And so that's the almost daily reminder for myself to keep it focused. And that brings me back to center. Like, yeah, it's worth it.
Thank you, Erica. That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Deepa?
Um, I would say that a couple of things that I've been focused on, and I really appreciate, Vishal, your point around reducing the clutter, is one, I've been trying to get more local in the community that I live. And so whether that's connecting to my kids' school or to local organizations that are focused on immigrant defense, just really leaning into where I live. And the second is finding political homes in communities that I'm from. So the Asian American, South Asian communities, and really leaning in there and putting my work and energy into those spaces.
Thank you, Deepa. Kelly, and then we'll go to Jennifer.
Sure. Just being hyper vigilant about my boundaries, and protecting my time. Being able to still have agency over my time is really important to me. There's so many, I'm so grateful for this conversation. We focused a lot on like external threats related to the administration primarily, but there are all sorts of threats and risks that are that you're coming up against every single day. A lot of us are considering limiting our capacity. And so there are reputational risks associated with transitioning out partners and consultants and team members and all that stuff, not to mention who your funding partners are, because corporate America is getting in the crosshairs, especially with progressives, and a lot of those corporations support our work. And so the risks are just legion. And something that I've learned at this stage of my career and stage of my life is that I tend to think that I manage stress very well, but what got you here won't get you there. And the practices that I've had in place for years are no longer sufficient just because of the volume and the accumulation of stress. A lot of times we think, those of us who t tend to be pretty grounded, that we manage stress well, but that doesn't mean that your body is not taking in concentrated amounts of stress that you're just trying to like manage. And your body keeps the score. And so I've been reminded a couple of times by my body that I'm not as great at managing stress as I think. And so for me, it's just required a hypervigilance with my boundaries and getting curious, going back to what Erica said, interrogating like what is working, what is not, and being open to exploring new ways of staying grounded and prioritizing myself. That's the last thing that I'll say. A lot of times, especially folks who are leaders in this space, we tend to be caretakers and both in our organizations and in our lives. And we think about ourselves last, and to think about ourselves and to prioritize and center ourselves feels selfish. But this is a time to get selfish. Do what you need to keep your cup filled, because you can't pour from an empty glass, which is what we all know. But it's hard to enforce sometimes, but it's something that I really put a lot of that I really am forcing myself to prioritize me.
Oh my goodness, these so good, and I'm just in such deep gratitude to have been a part of this panel, but more so just for the gems and the wisdom that have come. So thank you all, and thank you everyone that's joined today. I think for me, there's two things. So one is I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, two boys, and they keep me so grounded, whether it's, one of them climbing on my head while I'm, on a call or something like that, and just, instantly, just being that reminder of what matters. And I've also just been spending time thinking about my own family tree and how I am where I am. And that was a part of my ancestors' dream, and how I'm building towards what I want my sons to inherit as they grow up, and the things that they'll have to navigate and how I prepare them for that. So I think that's one thing. The other thing, the arts. The arts have been keeping me so grounded. The beauty, the imagination, visual arts, performing arts. I, was fortunate to be able to recently go see Gypsy on Broadway with my mom, and just, take a moment to just enjoy just the passion and the wonder that comes from that. So the arts have been just such a treasure for me. They always have been, but I think there's something about them in this time that's really just helping me stay grounded.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your wisdom and insights. This has been really just an amazing conversation, and I'm so glad to have had it with all of you. I hope that everyone has been able to take something away from this conversation, small or big, and know that we are all in this together, and we're all continuing to work on this together. Thank you so much for your time. And again, we will share the recording and key takeaways later, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.